Of the Lou Douglas series, and I would like to welcome you this evening to the, well, this is the 10th anniversary series. We've had some difficulty counting because last year, you may recall, we moved from a spring format to a fall format, so we had two. It's really back-to-back. Spring semester and then fall semester. But this is roughly the 10th anniversary series. The Lou Douglas lectures are given in honor of Professor Lou Douglas, who was a distinguished professor of political science at Kansas State University and supported UFM from its beginning. He was on the faculty from 1949 to 1977. He had a broad experience. For example, he taught overseas several times in Japan and in the Philippines. He did scholarly work on Midwestern populism. Tonight I found out that he was a superintendent for 9 years in Nebraska. The reason why we particularly find him dear is not only these reasons, but also the contribution that he made to UFM. And in addition, the contribution that he made to progressive politics throughout the state. He would often be 5 or 10 years ahead of let's say, the population in general, sometimes even further ahead than that, in terms of issues such as civil rights, the opposition to the war in Vietnam, income distribution, and these sorts of issues. To honor him, friends, colleagues, students, university departments, churches, and community groups have contributed to a lecture series that emphasizes the issues that were important to Lou Douglas, namely human rights, social justice, world peace, and international development. Take note in your program that continuing sponsors of the series include University for Man, Division of Continuing Education, Student Governing Association, Pre-Law Club, Ecumenical Christian Ministries, Office of the Provost, Department of Political Science, and you'll notice that there are quite a number of other departments and groups that have made a contribution to the series. You might take note, especially in light of the fact that 2 or 3 of our speakers are going to focus on energy, conservation, and trying to conserve on resources, that the programs are printed on recycled paper. And you are invited, if you do not want to take the program with you when you are finished, there is a table in the back and it can be recycled and used again. Lectures will be videotaped by Living Image Video Enterprises, and these videos are available at Farrell Library, and individual copies can be ordered from Living Images. All of you are invited to a reception following the lecture. It's in the lobby of Forum Hall, so it's very close here. The reception is being sponsored by the A.Q. Miller School of Journalism. And the next lecture, let me remind you, will be on Tuesday, September 25th, and will be given by David Orr. He will speak on refugees or homecomers, the if I can get this word right, reinhabitation, I believe is the word, of rural America. Should be an interesting speech. I would like to call attention to the board members. Please look at your program to be aware of who the board members are who have conceived the series and have brought it together. And in addition, I want you to be aware of the fact that our coordinator is Karen McCullough, who does much of the nuts and bolts in terms of seeing to it that the series comes together. I would like to, let's give a hand to the board members and to the board. On the stage, to your right, far right, is Chris Kern, who's chair of the Student Senate. Let me introduce to you Carol Oakrup, who's director of the, will I get it right this time? The A.Q. Miller School of Journalism. You are aware of the fact that in the last several years, what was the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication was lifted up to the status of a school. And Dr. Oakrup will be introducing our speaker for tonight.
I was awfully pleased when I was asked to introduce Molly Ivins, because I have felt that I had a sort of special affinity with Ms. Ivins since she spoke here as a guest of the School of Journalism some 15, 16, 17 years ago. And at that time, while she was here, a student in one of my classes took it upon himself to point out a special similarity between Molly Ivins and me. He said he didn't think either of us should have much trouble in what was basically the man's world of journalism, because we were both big. I have often wished that God in his wisdom had cloned me like Molly Ivins in some other ways as well. I wish, for example, that I had her gutsiness, that I had her wonderful affinity for use of the English language and her ability to tell it like it is. Molly Ivins writes about Texas politics, which is a challenge for anyone, as a columnist for the Dallas Times-Herald. She's from Houston. She has a BA from Smith College, a master's in journalism from Columbia University. She also studied for a year at the Institute of Political Science in Paris. Molly started her journalistic career at the Houston Chronicle, went from there to the Minneapolis Tribune, where she says that she covered militant blacks, angry Indians, radical students, uppity women, and a motley assortment of other misfits and troublemakers. In 1970, she returned to Texas as co-editor of the Texas Observer, a sprightly, muckraking publication, and that's what led us to invite her to speak at K-State in 1973. From 1976 to 82, Molly Ivins worked for the New York Times, and I always did think that was strange. Because the Times is stuffy and Molly's not, and I always thought they were an odd fit. She returned to Texas in 1982. You may have seen some of Molly's work in Esquire, Atlantic, The Nation, Harper's, TV Guide, or some other publication. Or you may have seen her on the McNeil-Lehrer Show. You may have heard her on NPR. And I'm awfully pleased to introduce her to you at this time. Molly?
Thank you so kindly, and Carol, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm going to talk about the media and politics. I have been a political reporter for most of my adult life, and I want to start out by trying to tell you all what it is like to be on the inside of politics as an observer. As Mr. Jefferson said, an alert and vigilant press is the guardian genius of democracy. And what is it like to be part of the old guardian genius? Well, I thought I might start by telling you all about our last primary day down in Texas. The flower of the political press corps of the great state was gathered in the House press box You see, we couldn't do anything about the election until they quit counting the votes, until the polls closed, so we were over covering the third of what turned out to be 4 special sessions on the same subject. And I must admit that though the subject was important, it was equalization of school financing, our attention had been drawn off the subject entirely by a remarkable development within our own profession. The PM edition of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram contained an astonishing 8-column headline, "Poodle slain by Archer." Yep. A curly-haired canine in Cowtown has been done in by bow and arrow. Front page headline. We were so intrigued by this, we were sitting in the press box, worrying neither about who was going to become the next governor of Texas, nor about the schools of the great state. We were working on most common reactions to poodle slain by Archer. I have the list here. 1, taffy on a stick. 2, I thought he said he was going out to shoot pool. 3, everything was fine until I yelled fetch. 4, where's a cat when you really need one? 5, I shot the arrow into the air, and when it came down, there was this damn dog. 6, arrows don't kill dogs, archers do. 7, shish capoodle. 8, at least it wasn't a real dog. Okay. And there are 2 others too bad to repeat. I also think, when I think of what it's like to be a political reporter, of the best day I ever had covering George Bush, who to my amazement is now President of the United States of America. I first covered George Bush in 1966 when he was running for Congress, and have long been of the opinion that George Bush is not, in fact, a twit. He merely has twit tendencies. It is one of his oddest personal traits that at least once a day George Bush attains a level of transcendent dorkiness. Now, the man is not stupid. He really has lovely manners when he's not irked. And there's a great deal to be said for George Bush. He's a lot smarter than Ronald Reagan, for one. But the best I ever had with him, and I should say in fairness to George Bush, that he was having one of those days that every politician has in the course of every political campaign. It was, and this is the one that sends shudders through the heart of every campaign manager, the day when nothing would go right. It was 1984. George Bush was running for vice president against Geraldine Ferraro. We were in southern Minnesota. George Bush had to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to milk a cow in order to demonstrate his concern for the plight of the American farmer. Now, you may be aware, particularly being here in Kansas, that American political tradition calls for the politician who is about to milk a cow, in order to demonstrate his concern for the plight of the American farmer, to wear a checked shirt. This underlines the depth of your concern for the plight of the American farmer. And Bush did show up, properly clad in a red and black checked shirt, but he had it on underneath his pinstripe blue State Department suit. It was the wrong look. It was not only the wrong look, it was the worst case of attempted milking by a politician I have ever heard of. George could not get a drop out of that cow. Either George had forgotten how to milk, or the beast was a Democrat. He comes around to the back end of the cow to explain to press why he's having no success that morning, forgetting what no real Texan should ever forget about cows. Yes, farm state folk, what do we know about cows? They are the only mammals that are retromingent. They pee backwards. Yes, there it was, all up and down the leg of his pinstripe State Department suit. It was not even 6:30 in the morning, and the day proceeded to get worse from there. Every time they handed that poor man a baby, it would burst into screams as though somebody had just stuck a pin into it. He got as far as Green Bay, Wisconsin, told the crowd there how much he loved the Minnesota Vikings. And then we went on to Milwaukee. Now, this was just a few days after George Bush's nationally televised debate with Miss Geraldine Ferraro. And in the course of that debate, as your real political trivia buffs will recall, George Bush had asserted that Walter Mondale had said that our Marines in Lebanon died in shame. Walter Mondale never said that. He said our Marines in Lebanon died in vain, and he had demanded that George Bush apologize for having so distorted his words on national television. That very afternoon, in response to this demand, George Bush held a press conference with a dictionary trying to prove that in shame and in vain mean the same thing. It was one of those performances it was so bad that you're just embarrassed to be there taking notes on it. And word of this lamentable affair went out to the Mondale camp, which, as I recall, was in California that day. And Walter Mondale went into what I presume was some kind of Norwegian rage and said stiffly, George Bush does not have the manhood to apologize. So word comes back to our camp. We go trotting up to the Vice President. Mr. Vice President, Mr. Vice President, Mr. Mondale says you do not have the manhood to apologize. What is your response? And George Bush said, I swear to God, well, on the manhood thing, I'll put mine up against his any time. Standing there with our notebooks and pencils going, did you get that? Well, I want to tell you the rest of the day was even worse. And by the time it was over, George Bush did not want to see any more of us, I guarantee you that. And he goes out to the airport to get on a little Air Force Two. He's flying back to Washington. The press corps is staying in the Midwest to pick up somebody else. We go trotting out to see if he's got any last comment. He indicates, no, he's not going to answer any questions. Then he looks at us all and says, so long. And with one voice, the entire press corps said, how long, George? That's our slogan for the rest of the campaign. How long, George? All right, since any discussion of the media and politics these days seems to be fairly depressing, let me begin by reminding you all that despair is not only a sin, it is a luxury we cannot afford. I would further remind you of the immortal words of that great American Spiro T. Agnew. For all its faults, the United States is still the greatest nation in the country. Now, having established our patriotism, let's go on to the state of politics in America. In this country, we have many elections, but we have no politics. We are the heirs of the greatest political heritage any people has ever been granted. It goes like this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. Those are ideas that when they first appeared in history resonated so deeply that they touched off revolution, and they still do today, more than 200 years later. In the country that is the heir to that legacy, we have the lowest rate of voter participation of any democracy on the face of the earth, except for the Republic of Botswana, where I have always suspected it is harder to get to the polls. More than half the electorate in this country very sensibly chooses not to vote. And what we want to look at tonight is why and what can be done about it. Every year, high school students are surveyed by Purdue University concerning the Bill of Rights, and every year a majority of them report that they disapprove of it. Gore Vidal once suggested that we make that annual survey sort of a national holiday like St. Valentine's Day. Congress shall make no law, concerning the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition their government for the redress of grievances, This is considered by the majority of high school students every year as some kind of utterly radical nonsense, probably Marxist in origin. I must admit to you that the real tragedy of the United States at this time is not the collapse of an empire we never knew what to do with anyway. It is the collapse of the idea of citizen. Since approximately 1950, there has been very little connection between the government of this nation, which represents the nation's corporate interests, and its people, who are not represented at all. George Wallace used to suggest, with his fine populist wisdom, that there was not a dime's worth of difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. So many people have said over the years, those of us who are prone to reform, that perhaps what we need in this country is a third party. No, we don't. To get a third party, first you have to have two others. I believe that the oligarchy in this country is growing more resilient and more oppressive. For the last 30 years, dissent, constitutionally protected dissent in this country has been contained by the fear of communism. A communist, you understand, is anyone who criticized the national security state or the defense budget. Through those years, the United States, a great republic, gradually became a garrison state, which is to say that its economy is and was controlled by military spending, driven by military spending. A garrison state is forever at war, either hot or cold, because it is that way more easily controlled by the few. It is a garrison state because that means profits for the few. During the last election, only Jesse Jackson said that if the defense budget is not severely cut, there will be no nation worth defending. In the course of that campaign, the media of this country demonized and trivialized Jesse Jackson to an extent to which I suspect he will never recover. I will tell you, as one who has worked inside both establishment and non-establishment media in this country, that by and large the pulpit in America is denied to anyone who does not approve of the misdeeds of our government at home and abroad. The extent to which it is possible to express dissent through the establishment media in this country is almost non-existent. And I speak as one who does it 3 times a week in an establishment newspaper. The fact that I do it doesn't mean that the system is healthy. Not at all. In this country, we have the lowest reading skills of any nation in the first world. Our people, frankly, are easily manipulated by television, and that is what our politics has become, a series of 30-second political advertisements, a series of blips on the nightly news. We went through an entire presidential campaign a few years ago discussing not one single one of the major issues facing this country. We had a campaign based on the flag and Willie Horton and fear and nonsense. We discussed none of the issues that confront us as a people. What we constantly have in our politics is a very, very old con game. Let me show you how it goes. See my hand? Look at my hand. Watch my hand. Keep your eye on this hand. Keep your eye on this hand. Keep your eye on this hand. Watch it. Watch it. Watch it. I got your wallet. I'll tell you how it works. One of the most skillful demagogues in the American Congress is a man named Jesse Helms. Mr. Helms has been on a great crusade. He has discovered dirty art, funded by the taxpayers' money, and he has created such an uproar over this dirty art as you would not believe. Now, let me point something out to you. The National Endowment for the Arts in this country, the NEA, takes from each of you 63 cents every year. At most, 2% of the grants ever made by the NEA have been considered controversial, even by the standards of Senator Helms. That's 2% of your 63 cents. By contrast, each of you will be soaked for $5,000 in order to bail out failed savings and loans institutions. Senator Helms voted for the Garn-St. Germain bill that deregulated S&Ls. Isn't it wonderful? Aren't you relieved that he is there making sure your tax dollars don't go to waste? Thank you. the alert and vigilant guardian genius of democracy, in the course of the last 10 years, has ignored major stories. The American press missed the Iran-Contra scandal. It missed the savings and loan mess. It missed the scandal at HUD. It failed to record the growing economic inequities between the richest and the poorest people in our society, which are now becoming so aggravated that political unrest will inevitably follow. It ignored the cause of homelessness. It wrote a great deal about homelessness. We covered homeless people. They appeared on grates. They were sort of hard to ignore. That is one of those most problems in politics are genuinely complex. There are always a number of contributory factors to any given problem. The problem of homelessness is one of those wonderful rare examples where there is a cause and an effect. If you cut $15 billion out of the budget for low-income housing, the result is a lot of homeless people. Isn't that amazing? But we were all over the broccoli story, and I think that we should be given credit for that. Now, I look at the performance of the press. I find it inadequate. That is considered a state of political ethics in our great nation. If you will forgive me, I will now go to my home state. What I am about to try to explain to you with a series of illustrations is that politicians in this country have ethics. They also have an overdeveloped sense of the extenuating circumstance. Bill Clements, the governor of my state, was chairman of the Board of Regents of Southern Methodist University at a time the university was slipping money to football players, which is illegal under the rules of the Southwest Conference. In fact, there was a regular payroll funded by great football boosters at the university, and SMU had been 3 times warned by the Southwest Conference that it was guilty of improprieties. 3 times Bill Clements came in before their hearings and under oath lied to them. The school was finally suspended from play for a year when it came out that they had done nothing to remediate the illegalities with which their football program was run. When we asked the governor why he had lied, he said, "Well, there was never a Bible in the room." Now, you see, you have to take these things into consideration. When the Speaker of the House, Gib Lewis, down in Texas, was caught taking favors from Parks and Wildlife. Basically, Gib has a couple of ranches, and the people at Parks and Wildlife had been stocking his ranches with your deer and your doves and stuff that people like to hunt, fish, put fish in his lakes, and all this, of course, the expense of the taxpayer. So when we asked the Speaker about it, he said, "Well, I have been helping Parks and Wildlife for 17 years. If they owe anyone a favor, they owe me a favor." Well, you see, you've got to consider these things. We say down in Texas, if you can't take their money, drink their whiskey, screw their women, and vote against them anyway, you don't belong in the legislature. I remember the time we caught Senator Bill Moore of Bryan carrying an insurance bill, and since he has a little insurance business there in Bryan, it would certainly directly benefit him. We said, "Senator, how come you're carrying this bill that's going to make you money?" And he said, "Well, I wouldn't make a whole lot of money, I'd just make a little bit." You've got to take these things into consideration. Senator from Lubbock, Kilmer Corbin, first elected back in '48, bless his heart. He and Bill Moore, the aforementioned Bill Moore, as young senators, were holed up in the Driscoll Hotel drinking whiskey and interviewing secretaries. When came a knock on the door, and it was the lobbyist for the Chiropractors Association. Now, every year down in Texas, we have the annual fight between the doctors and the chiropractors. The doctors always win because they have more money. Well, the chiropractor lobbyist came around, and he offered Kilmer and Bill Moore each $300 to vote for the chiropractor bill. Kilmer took the money. And then he voted against the chiropractors. The bill came up very early that session. Well, now in Texas politics, that's considered dishonorable. When you're bought, you're supposed to stay bought and know it. The chiropractor lobbyist no in. He came over and said, "You sorry son of a bitch, you voted against my bill." And Kilmer said, "Yeah, the doctors offered me $500. Well, that annoyed the lobbyist even more, and he commenced to cuss Kilmer up one side, down the other. Finally, Kilmer got kind of defensive. He said, "Well, you knew I was weak when I took the $300. Well, as a fellow once asked in another time and under other circumstances, what shall we do? let me suggest to you, as one who has followed politics for a long time, that there is a first step. It is a sine qua non, without which nothing. No other reform we can try will have any meaning whatever unless we first fix the means, the methods, the money by which campaigns are financed. The first step is campaign finance reform. There is now gathering popular support, a move to think that we might be able to fix what's wrong with our political system by limiting the number of terms a congressman or a senator can serve. What on earth difference do they think it will make if we limit their terms, as long as these people are elected by the same coalition of monetary interests that elects them now? That's nonsense. I would further suggest to you that there is a second reform, relatively simple. A law to be passed by Congress which states, no candidate or party shall be allowed to buy space or time in the media. Thank you. A third step, also relatively simple. Currently the practice in Great Britain and a number of other advanced democracies. Limit the time of campaigns to 6 weeks. Make time on television available for daily debates. And do nothing more. I don't think that what ails the system is terribly difficult, although I hate to suggest that there are simple answers to complex questions, as those of you who follow the intricacies of campaign finance reform know that in itself is an extremely complicated set of questions. One of my theories of government, developed over many years of watching it, is what I call the theory of perpetual reform. Any given reform is good for about 10 years, after which the sons of bitches figure out how to subvert it, and you've got to go back and re-reform your reforms. So this is not something that we can fix and consider fixed for good. I think that it is our responsibility, certainly as members of the press, to be alert and vigilant. I think that a winning formula to restore the public is to move boldly forward into the past, and would particularly recommend, for this purpose, Henry Clay, the great America firster, who wanted to spend the public monies on education and economic development and very little else. I think he had the right idea. I'm not sure if there is anything wrong with isolationism myself. Since the Cold War ended, less than a year ago, we seem to have been involved in a hate of the month club, as though there was some desperate search to replace communism as an external menace without which we might all fall apart. We've been through the Ayatollah Khomeini, Muammar Gaddafi, General Noriega. For a while, Japan was coming on very strong, but of course, now supplanted by Hitler Jr. in Iraq. As Mr. Machiavelli observed many, many years ago in a book called The Prince, there is nothing so useful as a foreign war to take the minds of the people off troubles at home. For my end of our political spectrum, the press, I would actually recommend something that is generally considered heresy in my business. I would like to see a more partisan press in this country. I would like to see less objectivity in the sense in which it is traditionally defined by the American media. We had at one time a highly partisan press full of argumentation and contention and a great and spirited calling of names. Great fun if you go back and read around the turn of the century. The popular press in this country actually has a very proud tradition. If you go back and look under the mastheads of the old newspapers in this country, you'll find remarkable statements that would be considered terribly radical and terribly unobjective these days. Things like, this paper stands with the people and against the bosses, for the masses, against the tyrants. All kinds of just amazing statements of where the press should be. Frankly, I think that's where we should still be. I think the press ought to be partisan in behalf of the average American. Now, who's an average American? Well, The mean annual income in this country is a little over $20,000. Now, do I think it's fair to Donald Trump and Ross Perot that the press should be clearly biased in favor of people who make $20,000? Well, yeah. See, my theory is that Donald Trump and Ross Perot can afford to buy the best lawyers, the best public relations people, the best press agents, the best advertising companies, and they really don't need the press, you know? I don't think we need to worry about them. They can get their message out. I think there are other people in this society who need an advocate, and I think the press needs to take on that role. We should not be impartial. We cannot be objective. We should quit pretending that we can. I think when you read a newspaper, you ought to know where it stands. I'm tired of newspapers that have no stand at all, as though they had somehow collectively had some kind of prefrontal lobotomy. One of the drawbacks of objectivity as it is practiced in the American Press Corps is that we tend to make the simplistic assumption that truth lies about halfway in between any two opposing points of view. It's nonsense. Sometimes the truth is way to hell and gone at this end. Sometimes it's way to hell and gone at the other end. It requires a bit more energy. It requires reporters who are willing to get up off their butts and go out and look to locate the kind of information people in this society need. I suggest to you that there are very worrisome economic trends in our business that are militating against that kind of journalism. The increasing concentration of ownership of the media in this country is something that you should all be concerned about. It is true not only in terms of newspapers, which are one after the other being picked up and collected by these vast chains, put into the same basket. It is true in television, an increasing concentration of ownership in television. Even the major networks are now being bought by mega corporations. It is true in publishing, a story much overlooked. There are almost no independent publishing houses left in this country outside the universities. What is the result of this kind of economic concentration, and why should anybody worry about it? As you know, there is a new media giant, the result of one of those unspeakable mergers of the 80s, called Time Warner Incorporated. The first book suppressed by the new board of Time Warner Incorporated was a book by a fine journalist detailing the connections between some Warner executives and organized crime. The book had been accepted for publication. After the merger, it was rejected. General Electric now owns one of the three major networks. General Electric, among its many enterprises, is in the business of building and running nuclear power plants. What kind of reporting on nuclear power do you expect from that network? Those kinds of conflicts of interest are increasingly common in our business, as is a pressure for increased profits that results from the fact that many of the buyouts, many of these acquisitions of various media outlets have been done with junk bonds and what are called leveraged buyouts. The result is that people holding those bonds need to pay off a very high rate of interest. The only way they can do that is to squeeze additional profits out of the properties they have acquired. They squeeze budgets at networks, and journalists lose jobs. They squeeze budgets at newspapers, and the news hole closes a little tighter. This is going on throughout our business in all areas of it. I think there is a solution, but first we are going to need to take control of the political system again. We have anti-monopoly laws on the books in this country. They have simply not been enforced for a long time. I think the political leadership, real political leadership, would provide enforcement of anti-monopoly laws in this country. Now, before I depress you all too horribly, and I'm going to take questions after I get through talking, I want to chat with you all. I thought I would close by telling you a story that may or may not strike a plangent note with you. One of my favorite words, plangent. If you don't know it, run and look it up in the dictionary. In the newspaper business, we have a number of bizarre competitions, and one of them is in a category called Best Lead Ever Written But Not Printed. And the story I'm about to tell you It's a lead by a wandering journalist named Will Lawson, who a few years ago wound up working for a little paper in Redwood City, California. Redwood City is just a bit north of San Francisco. And the issue in the town at the time was it was growing pretty fast and was in some danger of becoming another bedroom suburb of San Francisco. And the question was whether they wanted to remain a little town with their own distinct personality or whether they wanted to go ahead and become just a big suburb. Well, naturally, the publisher of the paper wanted growth. And at that time, the impediment to growth in Redwood City was that the sewage treatment plant had reached capacity. And Will Lawson was assigned to go out and write a gripping series that would convince the good voters of Redwood City to vote for a bond issue to build a new sewage treatment plant. Will Lawson worked on it for 2 weeks. Actually, he just drank a lot of beer during that time. Came back, typed one sentence, and quit the paper. This was the lead. Even a sewage treatment plant can take just so much shit.
Thank you. I would be happy to answer questions. Stick up your hand. Ask whatever you need to know about the only 2 subjects on earth I pretend to be an expert on, and I'll see if I can fake it. Yes.
Tell us about John Henry, folks.
Tell us about John Henry Falk, came the request. Oh, Lord. John Henry was a good friend of mine who died just a few months ago. He's often cited as the man who broke the blacklist in the television industry. He was blacklisted when he was riding high, chopping in the tall cotton in New York City, had a network radio program, and in the early days of television, he was the host of the Today program and had quite a high-flying career. But he didn't hold with blacklisting, and he ran for union office. I think it was the American Federation of Radio and Television Artists, AFTRA it was called, on an anti-blacklisting platform, along with some other entertainers. And of course, as soon as they won, they were in turn blacklisted. And John Henry's career was destroyed. He was unable to get any work at all for 6 years. It took a long time for the case to come to trial. One of the greatest trial lawyers of the day, Louis Nizer, tried that case against one of the most despicable lawyers of the day, a man named Roy Cohn, who was the attorney for the blacklisters. It was a wonderful and interesting trial, and John Henry and Louis Nizer had asked for, I believe, $1 million worth of damages against the blacklisters, and the jury came back in after a few hours of deliberation and announced that they did not have a verdict, but they had a question for the judge. Could they award the plaintiff more than he had asked for? John Henry said Louis Nizer looked like a cow just hit between the eyes with an axe. He'd made mistakes before in his legal career, but asking for too little had never been one. The jury gave John Henry the largest libel settlement in legal history at that time, although as it turned out, he got almost none of that money. The legal victory was complete, the blacklisting system was broken. John Henry's career never recovered. However, to the end of his days, he remains one of the great freedom fighters I have ever known, and a complete delight from beginning to end. John Henry, among other things, taught me a lot about how to go freedom fighting. And what he taught me is that you got to have a good time doing it. You got to laugh. In fact, I remember a few years back, I was at a banquet where Joe Rao, who was one of the great lawyers who defended people brought before the McCarthy Committee during the era of McCarthyism. Joe Rao was in hospital and couldn't come to accept this big civil liberties award that was being laid on him, so he asked a friend of his to come and accept it in his stead. His friend went to see him in hospital and said, Joe, what do you want me to tell these folks when I accept your award? And Joe Rao thought back on the McCarthy era, all that fear, all those wasted lives, all the people who committed suicide, all the suppression of dissent and the distortion of the political system in this country. Joe Rao thought back on it and said, tell him how much fun we had. Tell him how much fun we had. And it is with that spirit that I believe in and continue to try to practice political dissent in this country. If you can't have a good time doing it, you shouldn't be doing it, and John Henry Falk was the man who taught me that. I'll just tell you one good Johnny story. I already told one today, and I don't want to repeat for anybody who might have heard it earlier. Johnny's career never really made a comeback, but he did get a regular part on a television program. It wasn't a network. It was one of those independently syndicated programs, one of the worst programs ever to appear on American television. My friend John Henry Falk was the resident political scientist on a program called Hee Haw. And one day during his Hee Haw years, John Henry got a call from, he was living in Madisonville, Texas at the time, gets a call from Atlanta, from the attorneys for a man named Larry Flint, who was the publisher of, check me on this, Penthouse magazine? Hustler magazine, worse than Penthouse. And Mr. Flint was then on trial for being a pornographer over in Atlanta, Georgia. And his first trial had ended in a mistrial when some particularly zealous proponent of Baptist morality shot him in the back and crippled him for life. And as though that weren't enough trouble, he had since been saved and brought to Jesus by President Carter's sister, the evangelist. Though he was not only crippled but born again, but still in big trouble. Because over there in Georgia, they really do not like Yankee pornographers. So this is trial numero 20, and the defense team for Mr. Flint and his charming magazine, Hustler, had tried to get the judge to accept any number of distinguished scholars and experts on the subject of the First Amendment. They tried to get Dershowitz from Harvard, they tried to get Bagwin from Yale, they had no luck at all. The court would not admit any of the defense team's experts, so at last in desperation they called John Henry. And they said they offered him a large sum of money to come to Atlanta, Georgia and defend the First Amendment. And he said, I do not take money for defending the First Amendment. However, if you will pay my expenses, I will fly to Atlanta and see what I can do to help. So that very evening, John Henry winds up on the 7th floor of a hotel in Atlanta, which has been completely taken over by the Flint entourage, which has decided that it needs a lot of security on account of Mr. Flint's already been shot once. And John Henry winds up, President Carter's sister, the evangelist, is there, and he's holding hands with some really disturbing-looking lawyers on one side, poor Mr. Flint crippled in a wheelchair, the president's sister over there, and a lot of sort of thugs who've been hired for security. And they opened their session on the defense with a prayer. And John Henry, who was not a religious man, said he prayed very sincerely along the lines of, Dear God, you have gotten me into some strange situations before. Please get me out of this one. The defense team warned John Henry that so great was the hostility against Mr. Flint, the Yankee pornographer, locally, that there was great security around the courthouse because of the first shooting, and every day they had to walk in through a ring of state troopers who were very hostile, who brushed up against them, who pushed them around, who searched them very roughly, opened their briefcases, threw their papers around. It was just a daily hassle. And once they get through the state troopers, they get into the sheriff's men who are running the courthouse inside, and those guys do the same drill, only even worse. So John Henry, who has already sacrificed quite a bit in his life for the First Amendment, gets ready the next morning to go try and be an expert witness on behalf of this unfortunate Mr. Flint, and fully prepared to be roughed up and maybe even bruised and banged a bit. And he said they started up toward that circle of state troopers, and they was all wearing shiny silver mirror sunglasses, big hog 45s on one end, big billy clubs low on the other. Meanest looking bunch of rednecks I ever saw in my life. And I was just, getting ready. My shoulders were hunched. I was ready to take the blows, and suddenly they began to part like the Red Sea before Moses. They fell back murmuring, It's John Henry Falk from Hee Haw. They asked for his autograph. He gets up to the sheriff's men even meaner than the state troopers. They all murmured to one another and wonder, It's John Henry Falk from Hee Haw. It's John Henry from Hee Haw. They get into the courtroom, everybody starts beaming. It turns out the judge watches Hee Haw. Even better, the prosecutor watches Hee Haw. Now, John Henry said that he had, on the way over to Atlanta, bought his first ever copy of Hustler magazine at the Houston International Airport. Could not understand why the lady who gave him the magazine looked at him funny, slipped it out of its plain brown wrapper, and he said, Molly, you would not believe it. It was a picture of a naked lady with her legs open and her fingers stuck up herself and her tongue hanging out like this. And he said he commenced to look through the magazine. It was one picture after another of a naked lady with her fingers stuck up herself and her tongue hanging out like this. Well, he gets in there, and they let him up on the witness stand. And John Henry started by explaining, it's all true, that he was born and raised in South Austin, Texas, in a family that was not at all well-to-do, and in fact did not have indoor plumbing. And they had an outhouse, and his mother, being a saving woman, always used to put last year's Sears Roebuck catalog out in the outhouse to be used as toilet paper, saving a little there. But being a good Christian woman and a Methodist Sunday school teacher, she always cut out the pictures of the corset ads, lest the boys get excited out there in the outhouse. Well, of course, without saying anything, John Henry's made a few points about changing community standards and so on. And with that, he's rolling and he's starting to talk. And the prosecutor, no fool, leaps to his feet with an open copy of Hustler magazine in his hand, shoves it under John Henry's nose and said, "Mr. Falk, would you have wanted your same old Methodist Sunday school teacher to see that?" And there, by God, was a picture of a naked lady with her fingers stuck up herself and her tongue hanging out, like that. So John Henry, who was also no fool on the witness stand, leaped to his feet and said, "Shut your mouth, boy, lightning strike this courthouse." The idea of my mother seeing a thing like that. And then he sat down and said, "Look, no. I would not only not have wanted my mother to see that, I don't want my wife to see that, I don't want my son Johann to see that. I think that's ugly. I think that's really ugly. But let me tell you why the founding fathers of this country wrote the First Amendment the way they did." And then he launched into, as no one else could, the history of the Bill of Rights, about which he cared so deeply. Now, it's a wonderful story, but the fact is that Mr. Flint lost that case. And that's an important thing that John Henry taught me. The reason you got to have fun fighting is because you don't always win. All right, let's do another question. Yes, Wayne back above the...
Concerning your feelings on a partisan press, although that your idea would reach the majority of Americans, you still would not reach the opinions of the very rich or the very poor. How would you feel about possibly trying to re-legalize the Fairness Doctrine to try to reach all of these people?
Well, certainly the Fairness Doctrine had its uses. My own theory of... I have always, as a First Amendment absolutist, found the Fairness Doctrine troubling. I believe in a capitalist system you must have government regulation, but any form of government regulation of the media is, of course, very, very worrisome to me. I would suggest that if you there are other countries where the press seems to have grown naturally in a different form. Look at most European countries, there is the political press. When you buy a newspaper, you know whether it's monarchist or communist or socialist or Gaullist or fascist or whatever it might be. And you can take what it has to say with a grain of salt or a pound of salt, depending on your preferences. And it is understood that they argue from a partisan point of view, and they don't hide it, as so many of our media outlets do. To me, that kind of variety of political point of view would be preferable to an enforced fairness doctrine. It is also possible, and I don't know if it's remedial, that the real trouble with commercial broadcasting in this country was made when it was allowed to be commercial. In other words, had we done as Britain did with the BBC, we might be better off. On the other hand, that would be a form of government control. I don't know what to tell you. I will tell you, though, that advertiser pressure on television journalism is increasing. The ratings pressure is working to make television journalism worse, to appeal to the worst taste, to do flashier, glitzier, sleazier stories all the time. Yes?
You said you wanted to get away from objective press to a more opinionated one, but
There is no such thing as objectivity.
But okay, do you want to return to the days of Henry Luce? You know, and
There is no such thing as objectivity.
But how are we going to handle a press
That is openly and frankly partisan? Well, gee, you'd have to have enough sense to notice that, wouldn't you? I mean, I don't think people are dumb.
They didn't solve the issue back in the 50s and 40s when the country...
Oh, in the 50s, there was enormous pretense of objectivity. Of course, Mr. Luce considered his Time magazine objective. Did you not know that? Oh, my dear. Mr. Luce would have been the first to assure you that it was veritably the Bible. No, the whole pretense of objectivity is one of the things that has undercut American journalism. It's constant. What you will see in most newspapers, the press likes to cover two-sided conflict because it's easy. The easiest stories in the world to cover are football games and wars. It's the same story. There's two sides, they gain and lose territory. There's a scoreboard, so you always know who's ahead. And that's why we like to cover two-sided conflict. Reality is usually more complex than two-sided conflict. That's one thing that happens. We squeeze reality into that bipolarity because it's easier for us to cover. The second thing is that if you have a conflict and you cover it in an objective fashion, what you get is inadequate journalism. And that is the standard today. So the conflict on the city council. Councilman Smith thinks that the Acme Company should get the new road paving contract. Councilman Jones thinks the Zenith Company should get the new road paving contract. You're a journalist, you work for an objective establishment newspaper. You go and you interview Smith and you interview Jones. You spell their names correctly. You quote them each for 3 paragraphs, perfectly fair. And there you've done a really adequate, and in most cases, praiseworthy job of objective journalism. Now, what you haven't done is bothered to find out that Councilman Smith has been taking kickbacks from the Acme Company for the last 20 years. Jones is absolutely right. The Zenith Company has a much better bid. That's what objectivity does to journalism in this country. Yes?
What do you think about the new Ms. magazine? They removed all that.
They removed all advertising. I'm watching that experiment with great interest. It seems to me that if subscriber-supported publications can sustain themselves, this will be a major new hope for an independent press in this country. I'm watching that experiment with great interest. I myself edited a small magazine for 6 years that deliberately limited the amount of its income that came from advertisers. It was majority subscriber supported. It made a profit during one of the 6 years I ran it. We went down to Schultz Beer Garden and bought 2 pitchers to celebrate, and that blew the profit for the year. Yes, over there.
Has your own career ever been jeopardized by your views on corporate government?
Has my own career ever been jeopardized by my politics? Well, yes and no, I suppose. My ambition is to have it printed on my tombstone, she never made a shrewd career move. At one time, I left establishment journalism, cleverly thereby fifthing my salary. To go off and run a small left-wing publication. I had a wonderful time doing it. I've never regretted a minute of it. And I wound up having left an establishment paper, warned that I would never work in this business again, right? 6 years later, I went to work for the New York Times, which was probably punishment. Yes?
Have you ever gotten in trouble for failing to, or not failing, but refusing to reveal a source?
We were talking about that earlier today. One of the oddest ethical dilemmas, this man wanted to know if I'd ever gotten in trouble for refusing to reveal a source. One of the oddest ethical dilemmas I ever faced was a point at which my instinct was to do the reverse. I think I can tell this fairly quickly. About 10 years ago, when I was Rocky Mountain bureau chief for the New York Times, I became interested in the murder of Don Bowles, a reporter in Phoenix, fine investigative reporter who had been murdered by a bomb planted under his car by a man named Adamson. The state of Arizona listened to Adamson, who was a well-known professional criminal and hitman and liar and drunk. And Adamson shopped 2 other guys. He had a lawyer make him a wonderful deal, which was that if he named the people who paid him to hit Don Bowles, he could get nearly a walk on the murder itself. He shopped 2 other people. If you look at the record, I think you'll be as convinced as I was that the 2 people he shopped, at least one of them was completely innocent, and the other probably was too. One of the men convicted, who was then on death row, was a man named Max Dunlap. And Max Dunlap, one of the two guys shot by Adamson, had a lot of friends in Phoenix who just didn't believe that he would have anything to do with the murder. They had great faith in him as a person, and they began a campaign to free Max Dunlap. I got interested in the case and wrote about it and became more interested and looked at the evidence and studied it, and finally was able to set up an interview with the guy who set up the hit on Adamson, the middleman in the murder case. I interviewed the guy off the record with a tape recorder, a hidden tape recorder, I should add, which is not my normal practice. But I had some cause to worry about this fellow and his attitude toward me. He told me during the course of that off-the-record interview that Max Dunlap had never had a thing to do with the murder of Don Bowles. Now, this was a man who was then on death row for the murder. I called the lawyers in New York after the interview, told them what I had on tape, and said, look, there are lawyers working to free Max Dunlap right now. If they learn that I have been able to interview this man, they will probably try to subpoena this tape. The lawyer said, burn the tape. I said, what if it comes down to the execution of Max Dunlap, and I am the only person sitting around holding evidence that says that the man who set up the hit swears Dunlap had nothing to do with it? They said, burn the tape. I hung up, and I thought a real long time. I wound up not burning the tape. My compromise was that I stayed out of Arizona so that I could not be subpoenaed. My thought was that if it ever came down to the execution of Max Dunlap, it would be my responsibility to step forward, even though that interview was off the record. I think that sometimes you have moral responsibilities as a human being that go beyond professional responsibilities as a journalist.
Comment on or predict the likely outcome of the Texas gubernatorial election?
Question on the Texas governor's race. Oh, Lord. As though Governor Goofus weren't bad enough, it looks as though we may elect Clady Williams. This is an oil millionaire from Midland who paid an advertising company a lot of money, who's short and bald, to make him into John Wayne. He did a real good job. And we may wind up with him for governor. Let me tell you something that I really believe about rich men running for public office. It is not uncommon these days for people who have made a whole lot of money to decide that they don't want to spend the rest of their lives making a whole lot of money. They want to devote some time to public service, which I think is absolutely admirable. I really do. And I'm always excited when I hear about it. These are obviously people of some ability and skill, and they know about management, they know about running large enterprises. And I always say, great. Are they going to run for school board? Are they going to run for county commission? No, they always want to run for senator or governor. Buying political office among rich men these days has become a new hobby, a new toy, much as the multimillionaires of our past used to buy ocean-going yachts and thoroughbred racehorses. Now you buy yourself public office. It's a shiny new toy. It doesn't work. And I submit as example number one the man we call Governor Goofus, the incumbent governor of Texas, Bill Clements. Bill Clements is so obstreperous that, in fact, our agriculture commissioner, Jim Hightower, upon learning that Governor Goofus was studying Spanish, observed, oh, good, now he'll be bi-ignorant. Bill Clements is another rich, right-wing Republican oil millionaire who had never served in public office before. I mean, what he is Clayton Williams without the smile. And when he was first elected, he came in, he has a lot of ideas, he had a lot of energy. Maybe I didn't agree with his ideas, but you know, the guy's not stupid, he's got a lot of energy. He comes in, he says, now I want this and I want that. And they say, now wait a minute, Governor, first you got to get the legislature to go along. And he says, all right, tell the legislature I want this, then tell them I want that. They came back and said, Governor, the legislature just told you to put it where the sun don't shine. And Clements' response was, fire the legislature! This is a man who is accustomed to being the CEO, the top dog, the head guy in a hierarchical corporate structure. He is totally unable to deal with the reality of politics, which involves skills of compromise, consensus, persuasion, skills that are utterly alien to the nature of a rough and tumble son of a bitch who made it big by kicking other people in the ass. And I guarantee you, Mr. Williams, if elected, will have exactly the same trouble. Now, I have thought a lot about what would be the best possible training for a politician. I've thought a lot about it, and what I'm going to tell you is going to sound a little too cute, but I'm serious about it. Motherhood. And since we're all careful about sexism these days, let me tell you that good fathers would make good politicians for the same reason, anybody who'd taken that particular role seriously. I'll tell you what, though, I want to stick to mothers because that's what I'm used to. Now, I'm not saying all mothers would make good politicians. Frankly, there are a lot of bad mothers in the world. But I will tell you that all good mothers would make good politicians. There's two important things that good mothers know. They know what to do when there's two kids and one cookie. The older two kid, one cookie problem, you let the first kid divide the cookie, you let the second kid have first choice which half he wants, that's your two kids, one cookie, what a deal. You got your two kids in the back of the car hitting each other. Each of them claiming the other one started it, right? You hit me first, I did not. You didn't care what I did. Oh. Okay, Mom, what do you do? Test time. Well, you put on your best, this is your mother speaking in voice. And you say, I don't care who hit who first, you will now stop. Almost all political problems, from how you divide the budget in Texas to Beirut, Lebanon, are variations on two kids and one cookie and two kids hitting each other, each one of them claiming the other one started it.
Thank you very much, Molly Ivins. And I would like to indicate that you'll have a chance to ask further questions of her. Afterwards, there will be a reception right close to this hall, and it's sponsored by the Miller School of Journalism. Let me just indicate one other thing, namely that I would like to recognize a contributor to the series and the wife of Lou Douglas. Mary Douglas, would you please stand here? And finally, let me point out that on Tuesday, September 25th, please put this on your calendar, at 7:30 in this same hall, David Orr will be speaking on refugees or homecomers. Please ask others to come as well. Thank you very much for your attention, and we shall see you later.